The night was dark and quiet, but inside the Baptist Memorial Hospital, chaos reigned. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was in trouble. He was struggling to breathe, and his family was terrified. It was a scene that felt all too familiar. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had been discharged, but now he was back, surrounded by doctors and nurses who were doing their best to stabilize him. Linda, his girlfriend, had found him gasping for air, and they rushed him to the hospital. For 2 weeks, he stayed there, his body weak and fragile. The doctors tried everything they could to help him, but it was a tough battle. Elvis was not just dealing with his failing health. He was also fighting a war against his own demons. The hospital staff and even some members of his extended family would sometimes sneak him little bottles of liquor, undermining the efforts to get him sober. Elvis's family had always been his rock, and he was proud to be their leader. But family could also be a source of pain. When his father, Vernon, had a heart attack and was admitted to the same hospital, they arranged for their rooms to be next to each other. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it turned out to be a mistake. One day while Billy Smith, Elvis's trusted friend, visited both men, Vernon turned on Elvis, his voice filled with anger and frustration. "I have you to blame for this," Vernon said, pointing to his heart. "And you worried your mama right into her grave." Elvis couldn't hold back the tears. The words cut deep, and he wept, feeling the weight of his father's words and the guilt that had been building inside him for years. For the press, Elvis's condition was explained away as an impacted colon, hypertension, and an eye condition. But the truth was far more complex. He looked bloated, and he would joke about it, saying he looked like Mama Cass. But the real issues were his addiction to Demerol and his deep, morbid self-absorption. Despite his struggles, Elvis's generous heart never wavered. When he heard about a tornado in Macomb, Mississippi, he decided to do a benefit concert for the victims. It gave him a purpose, something to aim for, and his condition began to improve. By March, he was well enough to return to Los Angeles for a recording session with RCA. It was the first time in 4 months that he had worked, and it felt like a small victory. The recording session wasn't a classic, but it was a step in the right direction. Elvis chose songs he genuinely liked, just like he used to do at Sun Records. One song stood out, "Pieces of My Life" by Troy Seals. The lyrics resonated with him, and he played the recording over and over, long into the early hours of the morning. "I'm looking back on my life. I guess I threw the best part away." Elvis knew the feeling all too well. He was self-destructive and he knew it. But he wasn't sure if he could do anything about it. The road ahead was long and uncertain, and the weight of his past was heavy. But for now, the music was his solace, and it gave him a glimmer of hope. Elvis sat at the piano, playing a song he'd sung all his life. But now, he couldn't reach the high notes anymore. He had to sing in a lower key, and it disappointed him. He used to be a tenor, but at 41 he was a baritone. His voice wasn't as strong as it used to be, and he knew it. On stage, he'd sometimes apologize for not hitting the high notes like he used to. It was hard for him to accept that his voice was changing. Elvis's life was a whirlwind of touring and resting. He'd fly from city to city, performing in places like Johnson City, Charlotte, Cincinnati, and many others. The money was good, but the reviews were harsh. He'd forget the words to his famous songs, and sometimes he had to sit out while the sweet inspirations or the stamps sang. It was tough, but he was still Elvis, and people still loved him. He'd sing America the Beautiful patriotically, especially during the bicentennial year. Elvis had always been generous, but his spending was getting out of control. He'd given nearly $60,000 to Memphis charities the previous Christmas. His father, Vernon, started talking to him about money and the need to cut back. There were also legal troubles brewing. A fan had sued Elvis, claiming he was roughed up by the bodyguards, Red and Sonny West, and Dave Hebler. Vernon saw this as a chance to make a change. He fired the 3 men, telling them it was too expensive to keep them around. But it wasn't just about money. Vernon had always resented the Memphis Mafia that surrounded his son. Elvis was upset about the firing. Red, in particular, had been with him for 20 years. He felt betrayed and tried to call Elvis, but Elvis avoided him. Later, rumors spread that Red and the others were planning to write a book about their time with Elvis. This worried Elvis, and he offered them $50,000 each to cancel the book. They refused. Elvis finally called Red, trying to explain things. They had a long, emotional conversation. Red told Elvis he was broke and had sold his house. Elvis realized how much he had hurt his old friend. He apologized and offered to help, but the damage was done. Red was recording the conversation, and parts of it were later published in a magazine. The book Elvis, What Happened came out, and it was a bombshell. It revealed a lot about Elvis's life and struggles, which made him very upset. Despite everything, Elvis kept touring. RCA needed more songs for a new album, so they set up a recording session at Graceland. Elvis recorded a few songs, including Way Down, He'll Have to Go, and Pledging My Love. The last song was a ballad about a man who can't go home again, which hit close to home for Elvis. He was emotional during the recording, but he quickly lost interest and sent everyone home. Elvis was caught in a cycle of working hard to earn money, only to spend it and give it away. He was unwell but kept going, driven by the need to pay his staff and debts. A different manager might have canceled his tours and got him the help he needed, but Tom Parker just pushed him harder. Elvis had to keep performing, no matter how bad he felt. It was a difficult time for him, and the future seemed uncertain. Elvis and his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, were in a tight spot. Colonel had a gambling habit that needed feeding, and the only way to do that was to keep Elvis performing. So in 1976, the tours kept coming, one after another. Shows in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Pine Bluff, Arkansas, might not have been as glamorous as Madison Square Garden, but the money was good. Living costs were lower in the South, which helped the Colonel and Elvis's entourage stretch their earnings. Elvis's personal life was a mess. His relationship with Linda Thompson was rocky. She often nagged him about his other girls, and he'd deny it or apologize, but there were always other girls. Elvis wasn't obsessed with sex. He was more like a teenage boy trapped in a man's body. He was frozen in time, a remnant of his innocent teenage years before fame. Those memories of Mama and Dixie, along with the songs from that era, still played in his mind. Despite everything, he felt he was still Elvis inside. One evening, Elvis's old friend George Klein invited Ginger Alden, her sister Terry, and their younger sister Rosemary to Graceland. Elvis watched them arrive on his closed-circuit TV, and eventually chose Ginger. He took her to his bedroom, where they read books and talked late into the night. Elvis was intrigued by her and wanted to know more. The next night, he sent George to pick her up again. They flew to Las Vegas, where Elvis showered her with gifts and attention. Despite the excitement, Ginger's life with Elvis was far from normal. She was young and wanted to spend time with her friends, but Elvis wanted her all to himself. The tension between Elvis and Linda grew. Linda had become more independent, even starting a relationship with a pianist named David Briggs. When the tour reached San Francisco, Elvis suggested Linda take a ride back to Memphis. She saw through his suggestion and knew Ginger was already there. Linda left with as much dignity as she could muster, and Ginger took her place. Elvis's relationship with Ginger was intense. He showered her with expensive gifts, but his behavior could be unpredictable. He was needy and sometimes scary. One night, he fired a bullet into the wall because Ginger didn't bring him yogurt. He apologized, but the incident was a sign of his growing instability. Elvis's health was deteriorating. He was overweight, his movements were clumsy, and his voice was uneven. Despite the poor reviews, fans still flocked to his shows. When Ginger was with him, he made an effort, but without her, he was distraught. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he was so out of it that he couldn't perform and was flown home to the hospital. Elvis's emotional struggles were just as bad as his physical ones. He confided in Billy Smith and his wife Jo, worrying that Ginger didn't love him. After a fight with Ginger, he invited another young girl, Alicia, to join him in Las Vegas. He needed someone to be near him, to hold his hand and talk him to sleep. It was a pattern he'd repeated with Linda and Sheila. He was regressing, needing the comfort of a child. Despite his health and emotional issues, Elvis felt responsible for his employees. He couldn't take a break because they depended on him. His life was a never-ending cycle of performances, drugs, and loneliness. The only person who seemed to understand him was the Lord, to whom he often turned for help. Elvis was back on tour in April, hitting cities like Chicago, Duluth, Detroit, Milwaukee, and others with Ginger by his side. Their relationship had been rocky, but they were trying to make it work. The concerts kept coming, one after another, and in May, they moved on to places like Louisville and Providence. But the constant travels took a toll. In Binghamton, New York, Ginger had had enough and left Elvis, leaving him feeling lost and alone. Elvis turned to Kathy Westmoreland, a backing singer he had once insulted on stage, for comfort. She had been there for him, watching as he struggled night after night. Now she became his support. They stayed up all night, with Elvis talking about his mother, Ginger, and his career. He even asked Kathy how she thought he would be remembered after he was gone. Despite everything, he still felt like he hadn't made it as a movie star. He talked about himself as if he were already dead, even jokingly asking Kathy to wear white at his funeral. Kathy stayed by his side, consoling him until he fell asleep. After the tour, Elvis bought Kathy a car to thank her for her kindness. He was a generous man, always wanting to repay people who helped him. But sometimes he didn't understand that kindness and affection didn't always need a gift in return. Problems seemed to follow Elvis everywhere. In Memphis, he was being sued over the Elvis Presley racquetball center. Priscilla was asking for the money she was due from their divorce settlement. His father's heart was causing concern, and a psychic in Boston predicted on the radio that Elvis would die soon. The rumors only got worse when a Nashville newspaper reported that Colonel Parker, his manager, wanted to sell Elvis's contract. The Colonel denied it, but Elvis knew that Parker still needed him to make money. The worst came when a British tabloid started publishing excerpts from a book called Elvis, What Happened. The book described how Elvis, high on drugs and furious, had asked his friends to murder Priscilla's lover, Mike Stone. Elvis was devastated. "What's Lisa going to think about her daddy when she grows up and reads things like this about me?" He cried to his friends Billy and Joe. The Colonel, however, didn't seem to care. "Don't worry about it," he told Elvis. "It'll sell tickets." To make matters worse, Parker announced that a CBS TV crew would be filming Elvis on tour for a 1-hour special. The musicians and entourage were worried. Elvis was overweight and often ill, and some nights it was a miracle he made it through a show. But CBS was paying $750,000, and Parker wasn't about to turn that down. Elvis was torn about how to address the newspaper allegations during his performances. Should he admit he had a problem or deny everything? In the end, he chose to deny it. "We're here and we're healthy and we're doing what we enjoy doing," he told the audience in Kansas City, even though he didn't always feel that way. The CBS cameras rolled in Omaha, but only a few songs were good enough to use in the final show. Elvis still had his charm, but his health was clearly failing. He rallied for the filming in Rapid City, South Dakota, but the documentary would show a different side of him. When he introduced, "Are you lonesome tonight?" he paused, saying, "I was, and I am." It was a deeply personal moment. One night in Madison, Wisconsin, Elvis saw some kids harassing a gas station attendant. He stopped his limo, got out, and intervened. The kids were shocked to see him, and the situation quickly turned into a photo opportunity. That's what it was like being Elvis. He was a star, and people treated him differently everywhere he went. Elvis's last public performance was in Indianapolis on June 25, 1977. When he got home to Graceland, he was exhausted. He spent most of his time in bed, watching TV and reading. He called Priscilla to plan Lisa Marie's next visit, and called Kathy Westmoreland and Larry Geller. He was tired of being Elvis Presley, but he also loved it. His body was swollen and it upset him. He wondered where Ginger was, and if the new car he bought her would make her stay. Sometimes he would drive out at night, but he didn't have many places to go. The old studios and places he used to visit were gone, and he didn't feel like going to church. Dr. Nick still came by, and he and the Colonel rarely spoke, only about business. Elvis heard a rumor that Parker might not be American, but Dutch and an illegal alien. It didn't really matter to Elvis. He was more focused on his health and his upcoming tour. Lisa Marie's visit in July lifted his spirits. She played with her electric golf cart, and a new pony Elvis bought her. They went to the amusement park, and Elvis tried to be the best dad he could. But his mood was unpredictable. and he relied heavily on his medications. As August approached, the guys started to gather for the next tour. Elvis had his hair dyed and his costumes ready, putting on the Elvis mask once again. Elvis's moods were like a roller coaster. One minute, he was all excited about the tour, asking for new songs and music scores for the orchestra. The next, he was planning to announce his engagement to Ginger on stage. But when Ginger told him she wouldn't be there at the start of the tour, he got really upset and asked for another girl to come along instead. Elvis was also confused about his weight. He was over 240 pounds, and most of his stage suits didn't fit anymore. He didn't like being fat, but he didn't do much about it. He'd try a liquid diet for a few days or exercise for a short time, but it didn't help much. He kept thinking about the book, Elvis, What Happened? He told Ginger it was made up, but he knew it wasn't. He knew the book told the truth about his drug use, even though he always said he didn't have a problem. He knew he was an addict, but he didn't realize how serious it was. He loved the high he got from drugs like Dilla did. Elvis had a history with drugs. When he was younger, he used no DAWs to stay awake while driving with his friends. In the army, he got amphetamines to stay alert during night patrols. He even set up his own supply line. Later, he and his friends would take Dexedrine to have fun and stay awake in Hollywood. He knew Dr. Nick was trying to control his habit by giving him placebos, but Elvis could tell the difference. He always found a way to get what his body craved. On August 15, 1977, it was a wet and gloomy day in Memphis. Elvis woke up in the afternoon and played with his daughter, Lisa, in the garden. She was leaving for Los Angeles the next day, and he was about to start his tour. He wanted to see a movie but couldn't find a projectionist, so he called his dentist for an appointment at 10:30 p.m. He drove to the dentist with Ginger, Charlie, and Billy in his favorite car, a black Stutz Blackhawk, and brought 2 handguns with him. At the dentist's office, he got some cavities filled and his teeth cleaned, and he picked up a prescription for codeine. When they got back to Graceland, Elvis asked about the tour arrangements and looked at some new religious books. He really liked a book about the Shroud of Turin. He hoped Ginger would change her mind about the tour, but when she said she wasn't feeling well, he got disappointed and angry. Elvis called Dr. Nick around 2:15 a.m. because one of his newly filled teeth was bothering him. Dr. Nick prescribed him 6 Dilaudid tablets. Elvis's stepbrother, Ricky, went to the pharmacy to get the pills. Later, Elvis and Ginger chatted until around 4 a.m. Then he woke up Billy and Joe, who lived in a trailer, and asked them to play racquetball with him and Ginger. They didn't play for long, and after that, Elvis spent some time on his exercise bike and sang at the piano. Billy washed and dried his hair, and Ricky brought Elvis a packet of pills to help him sleep. The pills didn't work, and Elvis couldn't rest. He called Ricky again for a second packet of pills, but they didn't help either. Around 8 a.m., he asked his aunt to call Dr. Nick, and she got instructions to give him a 3rd packet of drugs. Elvis went into his private bathroom to read, and Ginger told him not to fall asleep. He smiled and closed the door. Ginger woke up later and realized Elvis wasn't next to her. She called his bathroom, but there was no answer. She opened the door and saw Elvis's body on the floor. She was scared and called for help. Nancy, one of the maids, heard the intercom and ran upstairs. She saw Elvis and ran down to tell Al, the wardrobe assistant. Joe and Charlie tried to help Elvis, but it was too late. His face was swollen and purple, and he had been sick on the floor. The ambulance arrived quickly, but Elvis was already gone. Dr. Nick arrived and tried to revive him, but it was no use. Elvis had been dead for hours. Joe called the colonel, who was in Maine preparing for the tour, and then called Priscilla in California. The news spread quickly, and reporters gathered outside the hospital. At Graceland, Aunt Delta and the maid, Nancy, cleared Elvis's private rooms of any drugs or drug paraphernalia to protect him even in death. An autopsy was started, and the next day, the medical examiner announced that Elvis died of a heart attack. However, the pathologists believed it was more complicated. Elvis's body showed signs of years of drug abuse, with a massively enlarged heart, damaged arteries, and a blocked large intestine. 2 months later, lab reports showed that he had 14 drugs in his system, 10 of which were in toxic quantities. Elvis's death was a shock, but those close to him weren't surprised. They had seen the signs and knew he was in trouble. The funeral was held at Graceland, and thousands of fans came to pay their respects. The Colonel was there, looking out of place in his casual clothes, and he brought some contracts for Vernon to sign, giving control of Elvis's merchandising to a company that would pay him a larger royalty. Vernon signed the contracts a few days later. Elvis was gone, but his legacy lived on. The world mourned the loss of a unique and irreplaceable star. After the ceremony, the coffin was placed in a white hearse. 17 white limousines followed, carrying the people who loved Elvis. The cars drove 3 miles past thousands of silent fans to a special place at Forest Hill Cemetery. All the flowers sent that day were given to the fans. The newspaper in Memphis wrote, "A lonely life ends on Elvis Presley Boulevard." Elvis had always worried about money. Even though he made a lot of money, when people looked at his finances after he died, they were surprised. They found out that, despite making hundreds of millions of dollars, Elvis only had about $10 million left. This included his home, cars, and airplanes. It was much less than some other famous musicians like John Lennon, who had over $150 million. But John Lennon had help from his wife, Yoko Ono, who came from a family of bankers. Elvis's money was managed by his dad, Vernon, and his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis thought he might be forgotten after he died, but the opposite happened. More people honored him and respected him after he was gone. In 1977, when he died, his record sales went up a lot, but the interest in Elvis didn't stop there. Over the years, he sold even more records, and now it's estimated that over 1 billion of his records have been sold. RCA, the company that owned Elvis's music, bought his old songs from him in 1973. This turned out to be a very smart move. They released his music in different themes, like songs from the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, as well as blues, country, rock, and religious music. They even released outtakes, which are songs that weren't finished but were still good. In 2016, they made a new album called If I Can Dream, where Elvis's voice was backed by a big orchestra, and it sold over 1 million copies. When Elvis died, a lot of musicians were very sad. Many of them wrote songs about him, like Neil Young, Bob Dylan, Mark Knopfler, Bryan Adams, Elton John, and Frank Zappa. Even Bruce Springsteen, who was a big fan, wrote a song called Fire that he hoped Elvis would hear. It became a big hit for the Pointer Sisters the next year. Elvis might not have understood why he sang the way he did, but the musicians who came after him knew he was special. They saw how he could sing in different styles, from rock and roll to country to blues. His voice could go from deep and rough to high and smooth, and he could express so many different feelings in his songs. When he sang, it felt like he really meant every word. Elvis's looks also helped keep his memory alive. In 1992, his face was on a postage stamp, and again in 2015. Graceland, his home, became a popular tourist attraction, and his music was used in movies and commercials. But the real reason people still love Elvis is his voice. It connects with people in a special way, and it's something that can't be explained. Even though some of Elvis's movies from the 1960s weren't very good, they don't seem to matter anymore. People remember the great songs like Suspicious Minds and Don't Be Cruel. His voice is what keeps him alive in people's hearts. After Elvis died, his daughter Lisa Marie Presley became the owner of his estate. She's a singer and has been married a few times. She's also the chairperson of the Elvis Presley Charitable Foundation. Her mom, Priscilla Presley, turned Graceland into a tourist attraction, which has been very successful. Priscilla also acted in TV shows and movies. Elvis's dad, Vernon, got divorced and moved in with a new partner. He died a few years after Elvis. Elvis's Aunt Delta lived at Graceland until she died in 1993. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, was found to be from Holland and had a different name. He didn't have a passport, which is why he never let Elvis tour outside the U.S. after Elvis died. Parker made a lot of money from Elvis's memorabilia, but he was accused of not always acting in Elvis's best interests. He died in 1997, with only about $1 million left. Many of Elvis's friends and bodyguards, like Lamar Fike and Red West, had a hard time after Elvis died. Some of them started new careers, like Red West, who became an actor and stuntman. Others, like George Klein, kept working in the music business. Dr. George Nishapoulos, who gave Elvis a lot of medicine, lost his medical license in 1995. Scotty Moore, Elvis's guitarist, is remembered as one of the most important guitarists in rock history. Sam Phillips, who first recorded Elvis, is remembered as a music pioneer. Elvis's best recordings show how versatile he was. From Heartbreak Hotel to Can't Help Falling in Love to Suspicious Minds, his songs cover a wide range of styles. People still listen to these songs because they can feel the emotion in his voice. And that's what makes Elvis Presley one of the most remembered figures in music history. Elvis grew up in a small house in Tupelo, Mississippi. His family was poor, but they were close. His mother, Gladys, and his father, Vernon, worked hard to make ends meet. Elvis had a twin brother, Jesse, who died at birth. This loss weighed heavily on Elvis, and he often thought about his brother. As a child, Elvis would sometimes visit the local cemetery, trying to find Jesse's grave, though it was never marked. Life was tough, but Elvis found joy in music. His mother often said, "You could play it when you sing, and you know people like to hear your singing." She encouraged him to buy a guitar, and he did, even though his father was skeptical. "I never knew a guitar player who ever made $1, Vernon would say, but Elvis was determined. Elvis's love for music only grew stronger. He listened to the radio and was drawn to the sounds of gospel and blues. He especially loved the Blackwood Brothers and other gospel groups. He would often go to the Tiger Shop in Memphis, where black musicians bought their clothes, and he would rub pomade into his pompadour to keep his hair in place. In school, Elvis was polite, and always said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. He was a bit of a dreamer, often thinking about becoming a star. He sang in the Humes High Minstrel Show and performed a song called "Till I Waltz Again with You." After that, he became more popular among his classmates, but he wasn't the best student. He often daydreamed about Tony Curtis and Marlon Brando, and he dreamed of being a star. One of Elvis's early friends was Red West. They spent a lot of time together, and Red was there when Elvis's career started to take off. Elvis also attended classical concerts in Overton Park, Memphis, though he found them a bit boring. The orchestra could play for hours, and most of the time the conductor wouldn't even look at his sheet. He once said, Elvis's big break came when he recorded "That's All Right" at Sun Record. Sam Phillips, the owner, heard something special in his voice. "Sing me something that means something to you," Sam said. Elvis did, and the rest is history. He started performing at small venues, and his unique style, part rock, part country, and part gospel, captivated audiences. He played at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show, where he sang "Old Shep," a song that reminded him of his childhood dog, Rex. Elvis's popularity grew, and he began to make appearances on radio and television. He appeared on the Grand Ole Opry, but the audience wasn't as enthusiastic as he hoped. Still, he kept going. He joined forces with Scotty Moore and Bill Black, and they formed a band that would change the face of music. Sam Phillips encouraged them to be different, to stand out. "Don't complicate it, Scotty. If we'd wanted Chet Atkins, we'd have brought him over from Nashville," Sam would say. Elvis's first big hit, Heartbreak Hotel, was a success, but it wasn't without its critics. Some thought it was too morbid, but Elvis loved it. "Hot dog me, play it again," he said when he first heard it. He appeared on CBS TV stage show, and his performances were electrifying. People were talking about him, and not always in a good way. Some called him Elvis the Pelvis because of his dance moves, but Elvis was unfazed. "That seems to me the most stupid thing an adult person can say," he told a reporter. Elvis's fame brought him new challenges. He was offered a contract with RCA, and he signed it. He also met Colonel Tom Parker, who would become his manager. The Colonel was a shrewd businessman, and he saw the potential in Elvis. "Don't you have a hobby or anything else to do?" the Colonel asked Elvis. "You're my hobby," Elvis replied. As Elvis's career took off, he faced pressure and criticism. Some people accused him of being a bad influence on young people, but Elvis stood his ground. "Why should music contribute to juvenile delinquency? If people are going to be juvenile delinquents, They'll be juvenile delinquents if they listen to Mother Goose rhymes, he told a radio reporter. Elvis's life was changing, and he was aware of it. He told his parents, "When I grow up, I'm going to buy you a fine house and pay everything you owe at the grocery store, and buy 2 Cadillacs, one for you and Daddy and one for me." His dreams were coming true, but the road ahead was full of challenges. Elvis Presley's life was a roller coaster of fame, fortune, and deep personal struggles. After years of making movies that he often didn't believe in, Elvis found himself reflecting on his career and the paths he wished he had taken. He felt a deep connection to his roots and the music that truly resonated with him, like the old gospel and blues that he grew up with. Elvis's relationship with his father, Vernon, and his stepmother, Dee, was strained. He often felt that he was the only one who could understand the weight of his responsibilities. Despite the tension, Elvis remained deeply loyal to his family, always putting their needs before his own. In the late 1960s, Elvis made a comeback with a television special that reignited his career. He returned to live performances where he felt most alive. He said, "It's very hard to comprehend, but it's my favorite part of the business, a live concert." His performances were electrifying, and he connected with his fans in a way that only he could. However, the pressures of fame and the demands of his manager, Colonel Parker, took a toll on Elvis. He began to rely on prescription drugs to cope with the stress and insomnia. His health declined, and his relationships suffered. He and Priscilla, his wife, eventually divorced, and he struggled with the loss of his mother, who had always been his rock. Elvis's final years were marked by a sense of regret and a desire to change. He wanted to make better choices and to be true to himself. He told his friends, "I'm never going to sing another song I don't believe in, and I'm never going to make another picture I don't believe in." But the road to change was difficult, and the pressures of his fame and the people around him often made it hard to stay true to his goals. Despite the challenges, Elvis remained a beloved figure, and his music continued to inspire generations. He was a complex man, full of contradictions, both a legend and a deeply human being. His legacy is a testament to the power of music and the enduring impact of a true artist. Even after his passing, Elvis's spirit lives on through his music and the memories of those who loved him.